All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this masterclass, three-part masterclass today. We have a day packed with learning. So welcome, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us today. And yeah, we're really glad to bring this to you today. And yeah, so we have a masterclass with Jasper Oosterveld, create a dreams teams with Microsoft Teams management across the entire life cycle. So a little bit about ourselves before we get started. My name is Laurent Saint-Pierre, but everybody calls me Larry. I am the Community Enablement Manager here at ShareGate. I've been with the company for about 6 years. Perhaps we've met if you travel to some local conferences. Maybe I gave you some sweet ShareGate swag in exchange for a quick conversation. And that's also how I got to meet our teacher today. Our teacher today is Jasper Oosterveld. How are you doing this morning, Jasper?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yep, loud
Yeah,
and clear.
perfect. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so hi everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So my name is Jasper Oosterveld, say it in Dutch. I'm a Microsoft MVP and I work for a Dutch company called InSpark as a modern workplace consultant. And in that role, I support customers implementing a modern workplace. No surprise there. But of course, one of my main focus is Microsoft Teams. That's why we're also here. And I do a lot around governance, adoption, and compliance, all in relationship to rolling out Microsoft Teams with customers. Yeah, so sorry, I'm very excited to be here today. So let me go over to the next slide. We can take a brief look at the agenda. So we're doing this in 3 parts. We're starting, of course, with the first part where we build a solid Microsoft Teams foundation from the moment of creation. Then we're moving on to the next session. That's an hour from now. We'll talk about maintaining a healthy and secure Microsoft Teams environment at scale. And the last part will be about defining end-of-life strategies to keep your teams organized and up to date.
And Jasper, just before we get started, I just want to point out for everyone that the sessions will be recorded. So we know that you have some stuff to do. You might have to jump out for a while. So don't worry, we'll be sending you the recordings after once the masterclass is over. And yeah, if you need to leave and you want to come back, you can just use the same link to jump on the meeting, the same one you just joined for this for the first class today. And yeah, back to you, Jasper. Sorry, just wanted to point that out and clarify that for everyone.
Yeah, no worries at all. Perfect. Thank you. So let's start with the first part of today. So what is the goal? So we're going to cover beginning of life best practices to help you understand why your users create their teams so you can apply the right governance policies and security, of course, the settings, of course, on security from the moment of creation. So we divided this part in 3 topics. So first we'll start talking about the creation process. Then we're moving on to the collaboration process, and we're finishing it off with the classification process. That's the last main topic of this first part. So let's dive into the creation process. So why do your users, your business users, why do you want to create teams? I think it's relatively simple, straightforward. They want to collaborate, right? That is basically what we all do in our daily work lives. We collaborate in one form or in the other. And especially these days, it's very common to also collaborate with guests. So those are people who aren't your direct colleagues, right? So that's what people want. And they're basically looking for an application that's easy to use that can help them achieve this goal. And of course, that's Microsoft Teams. But who can create a team? Of course, this depends on the settings in your Microsoft 365 tenant, but we can basically bring it down back to 3. So the first one is all employees. So that means that everybody within your company can create a team. Or you change that setting and you said, no, I don't want everybody to do it, but I want a selection of employees to create a team. And the last one is that means basically only IT is able to create a team. And all the employees, they cannot do that. They need to go to IT in some sort of form and ask them to create a team. I don't think that's that's the way to go, but it is an option, of course. So then the question is, where can I create a team? Well, this can be done at a lot of locations. So of course, we have the Microsoft Teams application. That application you can install as an application itself on Windows, for example, or you can use it through the browser. Very common is a provision application. So there's a solution, sorry. So this can be one you create yourself, for example, with the PnP commands, or maybe acquired one from a third party. What you can also do is create a team from within a SharePoint team site. So imagine you've been using SharePoint before Microsoft Teams was introduced, or before you want to use Microsoft Teams. What happens is the owners of a SharePoint team site will see a notification on the left bottom asking them, do you want to create a team for this SharePoint team site? So if they click on yes, it will be created. The team will be created, right? Or maybe a third party. So the team will be created. Yeah, that's the other option. And of course, what you can also do, and this is for administrators, they can go to the Microsoft 365 Administration Center. They can create a new group. They create a Microsoft 365 group. And during that process, the UI will also ask you, do you also want to create a team? So that will allow IT admins to create a team to the newly created Microsoft 365 group. What's actually very nice these days is that Microsoft introduced the concept of Teams templates. This was basically a request since the start, right? Because from the early on, when Microsoft Teams would launch, you can create a new team, but it was basically a blank team. So it came with like a general channel and the default tabs. Then Microsoft did introduce some options to provide some form of templates, but it was kind of complex and not really easy to use. So relatively recently, they introduced something called Teams templates. They give you 13 out-of-the-box templates, all aimed at different scenarios. So for education, healthcare, and I believe a couple other ones as well. But of course, you can also customize these. So you can use one and then build from that one onwards, or you can just create your own from scratch. It will allow you to add additional channels and also tabs per template. So that gives you some more flexibility to really customize that template and give your business users a template with, for example, a couple of additional channels with some tabs, right? This can be useful for scenarios where you work with certain project, sort of a project process like prints or like some agile method. So you can immediately give them the template with the channels that belong to the process. What you can do, you can also, you can provide all these 13 templates and maybe your own to all your employees, or maybe you want to say, no, I don't want that. I just want to offer them a selection. So that's what you can use a policy for. So you can go to the Teams Admin Center, you can create a custom policy, and then you say, okay, I want all my employees or a group of people just to use these templates. So what does this look like? So this is just a simple example. So in this case, we provided a couple of the out-of-the-box templates. So when I go to create a team, I go to the Teams application, I click on create a team. These are the templates I see. So you can give it a nice description. So to help your business users make the correct decision, they can click on it and the team will be created with the name you give it, of course, and the people you assign. So let's move on to naming policy. What is a naming policy? So again, a naming policy does allow you to provide a team with basically a predefined naming convention. To kind of explain that, I provided a little example. So imagine you have a team, the type of team that's a department, right? So what you maybe want to do is once you create a team of the type department, you want to add the word DEP, right? The abbreviation before the name of the department. And maybe you also want to provide a custom URL for the SharePoint team site that's connected and it comes with the team in Microsoft Teams. So that's a naming policy. There are a couple options to apply these. Of course, if you have one, you could use your provisioning solution. These solutions often come with that option to apply a naming convention or naming policy to the template you choose. You can also do it manually. This does only work for the Teams part though. So the example I showed in the previous template, DEP, they can do it manually. The SharePoint site, that only works with a provisioning solution. But you can tell your business users to apply one manually when they create a team. Or you can use Azure Active Directory. It also has a naming policy option. It does require a premium P1 license, and it's not really a flexible solution. So what do we recommend? What are our recommendations in relationship to a naming policy? The great thing about it is that it does really expose the purpose and goal of a team. It can be something, let's say somebody gives it a very like abstract name that's not very clear. It can be very confusing for your business users to decide, is that the team I want to join, or is that a team I'm looking for? But it also helps you as an IT admin to increase the ease of maintenance, because you immediately see the purpose of a team, right? You can see it through the name. You see, okay, this is a department, this is a project, this is a customer team, right? So it will save you a lot of valuable time to make certain decisions and to take action upon. So let's move on to the collaboration process.
Hey, Jasper, just again jumping in really quickly.
Yeah,
we see that we have a lot of questions already, which is great. Keep them coming. That's what we're here for. But we will do a dedicated Q&A session at the end, so you can keep your questions coming, and we'll answer those after the first, at the end of the first class, essentially. So just wanted to point that out. We are seeing your questions. We're getting ready to answer them, but we're just going to let Jasper go through the content, and we'll get to those very shortly.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Larry. Yeah, thanks again for the questions. It's awesome. And what Larry said, we'll discuss them at the end. We'll keep them coming. So the next topic is external sharing. Now, again, what is external sharing, right? So, of course, what you can do, and it's something we'll discuss as well, is that you can also invite a guest into your teams. So that guest basically becomes a member of your team. But instead of doing that, there are, of course, scenarios where that's something you don't really want. You don't necessarily want to invite somebody in your team. You just want to share a couple of files, right? Maybe an invoice, or maybe a requirements document, right? So that means that in that case, you apply an external sharing of that file. What will happen is that guest will receive an email. So he or she will receive an email with a link to the file or the files. And what's very nice is that by default, from a security point of view, that guest will receive an email with a verification code that he or she has to enter in. Once they clicked, I'll show you in a screenshot, they clicked on it, they have to enter the code, and then they will get access to that file. So I added an example in this slide. So in this case, you see my name there. I'm an admin. So somebody shared a file with me, an Excel file in this case. I have the email. I open it up. This is the screen I see. I click on send code, and I'll receive an email with the account verification code. Right? I copy the code. I go back to the browser. I enter the code, clicking on the, I think it's submit button or something. And you see, then it's checking. It's verifying the code. And once that happens, I get access to, in this case, it was an Excel sheet. I do always recommend ticking the box, keep me signed in. Otherwise, the next time you do it, you get another verification code. There's a certain time frame. I don't know off the top of my head how long it is. I believe it's maybe like a day or something, where you're still logged in. You don't have to enter a code all the time. So there are a couple of sharing links available. The first one is everyone, and this is literally everyone. So that means everyone in the world. So let's say that Excel file was shared with me, but the type of sharing link was everyone. That means I can send that link everywhere. I can put it on Reddit, I can put it on Twitter, whatever. Everybody can use that link and access that Excel file. I think we can all agree that's something that nobody really wants or needs. So this is one we often disable, but it is there. Maybe there's some business case that makes this useful, but I haven't come across it yet. Now we come to the two most common ones. So the first one is new and existing guest. New guest basically means that let's say I work for InSpark. Now I do work for InSpark. So I work for InSpark. And I've never shared a file with Larry. That means that Larry is considered a new guest, right? So I can do that. Existing guest means that Larry has already been added to my Azure Active Directory as a guest. because that's what happens when you share something with a guest. They access a file, then being added to your Azure Active Directory as a guest. So in that case, Larry is an existing guest. You can also say, no, I only want people to share a file with existing guests. And that's often a scenario where IT takes control of who is being added as a guest to their Microsoft 365 tenant. The most applied one is the second one. Sometimes we have customers who want to have more control over what's being shared with whom. They pick the third one. Well, the last one, of course, is disabled. That's one I won't advise, because otherwise people will find a different way to share a file with a guest. So where can you manage this? You can manage this in the SharePoint Online Administration Center. So that means that you as an IT admin needs to have at least those permissions, right? You need to be at least a SharePoint Online admin. And in that center, there's an option for sharing where you can define the sharing link, right? So you can set it on everyone, new and existing guests, or just existing, or disable it. These days, you can also use Microsoft Information Protection, the sensitivity labels part, and you can use a label where you define a sharing link that's allowed within a team. So this is something, so hold on for a minute. Maybe if you have any questions, wait, because we'll go a little bit more in depth about this later, but this is what's available. And of course, you can also use a third-party tool like ShareCade Apricot. So what is our recommendation? I would advise to go for external sharing with new and existing guests, because this will relieve you as an IT admin of a lot of tasks. Because what will happen is people will start sending you emails or support tickets asking them, hey, so let's say in Spark, it's set an existing guest. That means I have to send somebody an email or submit a service request like, hey, I want to share a file with Larry. Can you add him for me? Again, that if you really need to do that, it's fine, but do realize a lot of more work will come on your shoulders, right? So if you can, go for new and existing guests, so you also empower your business users. We also recommend to definitely implement a periodic review of sharing links. And again, if you have any questions around that, hold on to those questions until we're in the second session, right? Again, we'll talk a lot more about that. What's very important is that you definitely have to educate your team owners and the members, because you're giving them that ability to share a file with somebody outside of the company. So they need to be aware of course, how it works, but also about their responsibilities. Like, hey, realize if you do that, a file that maybe can contain sensitive information is being shared externally. So make sure that's you're really allowed to do that, right? And what you also should do is start with defining your classification scheme and strategy. And that's something we'll dive into later in the first part of later on with this session. We'll dive into that. Next up is guest access. So we just discussed sharing a file or multiple files with guests. This really dives into inviting somebody into your team as basically a member. But what is considered a guest? So a guest is somebody who doesn't have a Microsoft 365 license from your organization. So again, an example is that I have a license from InSpark, but Larry works for ShareGate. So he is a guest. But be aware, for example, we work with a lot of self-employed people, right? So we hire people to work for us. They'll get an InSpark license, but they're still a little bit of a guest, right? Because they're not officially an employee. So be aware of that, right? So if you give external people a license from your organization, the system won't see them anymore as guests. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, why would you allow this? Maybe you think like, why would I want to have guests in my team, right? It's a security risk. It's, we don't know what's going to happen. Well, there are very good reasons why you should do this. And of course, there are ways to manage this as well. That's something we'll discuss too. First one, you want to reduce shadow IT. Especially these days, everybody's connected to the internet somehow, tablets, phones, computers at home. They will find a way. So if you block it, so you don't allow your employees to share anything with guests or invite them, they will do it on a completely different way. They will get a Box account, a Dropbox. Perfect solutions, don't get me wrong, but not in this scenario, because you will lose track over your files, right? So you don't know what's happening, right? And this is a lot more efficient. If you invite guests into a team, you can use chat, you can easily share files. It's just a lot easier than, for example, sending emails or using some other tool, right? Because what you're probably already experiencing or working towards is that you want all your employees to have one application where they can do a lot of their work. And that's what Teams is, right? I can chat with my colleagues, I can see my files, I can see Planner, I can see my internet portal. That's a long list these days. So why not allow people to collaborate there with guests as well? And again, I will give you a lot more control because you're more in control, right? You control over the people who are being invited. You can, of course, admin, you can also revoke their access at any point in time. You get a lot more insights of like how many guests are in a team. And yeah, so a lot more control and insights are there over your colleagues and the content is being worked with. That is completely gone if people are gonna implement shadow IT. So for example, they get a box account, right? So what can a guest do? That's a good, of course, it's a valid question. Okay, I want to invite guests, but what are they able to do? So what is the impact for my Microsoft 365 tenant in relationship to Teams? Well, you can set certain settings in the Microsoft Teams Administration Center. I'm going to show you an example in a second. That means stuff you define there impacts all the underlying teams, but you can also change it on a per team basis. And I'll show you a screenshot as well. So the first one is this one. So this is an admin center. I'm not going to go over these settings. I only want to briefly discuss the first two. This allows your guests to edit their messages and also delete them. Please enable that if it's possible, because I'm in Microsoft tenant and they disable that. It's just really annoying because you probably had it as well. You type a message a little bit too quick. Somehow you click on the enter button and a half message is in the channel. And you're like, oh, I want to edit it. No, I'm not allowed to do that. So that's not the most ideal user experience. So that's the one I recommend to basically all my customers. Please turn it on. Then this is a screenshot of the settings in a team, right? So you see guest permissions. So this is off by default, and I think that's fine, right? I don't really see a scenario where you want your guests to delete channels, for example. Maybe allow them to create it, but again, is that really necessary? I would advise to keep a little bit more control over that internally. But again, if the situation is there, the business case arises, this is where you can enable it. So your guests are able to create channels, update them, or maybe even delete them. So how do you enable guest access? It's basically, it starts at the top, and the top is Azure Active Directory, right? That's where all identities are being managed and stored, right? This is where you can turn it off, basically for your whole environment, right? So make sure it's turned on there. Then within the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, you also have an option to turn it on or off. And that setting is related to Microsoft 365 groups. I can turn it off or on there. And if I turn it off, it does impact the way I can work with guests and teams. So basically, I can't, right? Then if that's turned on, I also have to make sure it's turned on in the Microsoft Teams Admin Center. And since a couple of months or maybe a month, Microsoft turned this on by default, especially for new tenants. I don't believe they touched it for existing tenants. I hope not. But be aware, if you start with a new tenant, it's on by default. So if you don't want that in the beginning, that's where you have to turn it off. So maybe, okay, now you've decided I know what guests are. I know what I can turn it on. I know what their permissions are. But what kind of guests can actually be invited? And again, this is up to you as the admin of your Microsoft 365 tenant. You can allow your business users to send basically an invitation. An invitation is that example you saw of the Excel sheet that was being shared to everyone, right? And that's the most inclusive one. But what you also can do, you say, okay, people can invite guests, that's fine, but specific domains are not allowed. So for example, let's say you work for Coca-Cola, you maybe block the Pepsi domain because you don't want people to invite people from the competition, right? What you can also do is the most restrictive one is that you determine who can share what domain people can share it with. So maybe you work at Coca-Cola and you pick this one and you say, okay, only with Unilever, for example. That means only with people from that company I can invite, nobody else. The most common one I see is the first one. In certain situations, the second one is being applied, and that's mainly for a competition point of view. I don't see it a lot, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. But the most common one is the first one. And this is basically an example, right? So what I just discussed, this is what it looks like in the Azure AD Administration Center. How are guests invited? Again, I can just leave it up to say, I'm not talking to you as an IT admin. You can just do it. You can be in charge, right? You can be the person, or maybe you or some colleagues who invite guests in Azure AD, right? That means you go there, you go to the Azure Active Directory, you go to users, and you create a new guest. You add the details, you click on send. That guest will receive an email saying, hey, you've been invited into the InSpark tenant. You accept your invite. From that moment on, people can share files with you or invite you as a guest in a team. The most common one, and it's the one we recommend, is leaving this up to the owners, right? So leave it up to the owners to invite guests, because an owner is the only role within a team that's allowed to invite a guest. Members cannot do that. And again, be aware that once you invite a guest, that he or she is basically considered as a member. So imagine you have a team, and you've been working with it for a while. You have maybe 5 channels. These are all public channels. There's a lot of files in there, chat. You invite a guest. That guest is now considered a member and automatically has access to all these public channels. Does not have to be an issue, but it's good to keep in mind before you before you initiate this process and allow people to invite guests. So something to keep in mind. So what do we recommend? Now, no surprise, we do advise to enable guest access, because again, it will reduce shadow IT, it provides a much more efficient collaboration process, and it will give you as an admin a lot more control and insights. Because otherwise, they will do it a different way out of your site, and you have no idea what's going on. And that's definitely something you do not want. That said, you definitely have to implement a process to periodically review your guests. And that's something we'll discuss in session 2. So if you have any questions, hold on with your questions, and then we'll discuss them once we reach that point. Again, highly recommended. I think everybody's saying it these days. Please enable an MFA, multi-factor authentication, also for your business users, but definitely for guests. Because again, this does increase the security and reduces the chance of security breaches or data leaks, because somebody has to log in, and then he or she has to use their authenticator app, for example, to say, okay, yeah, this is me, and then you get access to the guest to your tenant basically as a guest. So highly recommend doing that. Like I said, team owners, they are the only ones. So that role, the people within that role, they are allowed to invite guests, nobody else. So they need to be aware of their responsibilities. Like, hey, be aware, you can invite guests because that's what we want, right? We want to provide efficient collaboration and all the other advantages. But you have to realize that you're the one who can do this, but be aware of your responsibilities. Yeah, very important. I described a scenario where you have a team with 5 public channels. You invite a guest, and the guest automatically has access to all those public channels. What you probably want is a space within a team where you can just collaborate and communicate with all your colleagues and not with the guests that have been added to the team. Work with private channels. We also do this internally within InSpark. We have teams per customer, and in that customer team, we have a channel per project. And of course, there are times where we want to collaborate with our customers within a team. But every time now a team is created, and private channel is added as well, just for the InSpark employees. So that allows us to have a space where we can just work on drafts, on ask each other questions without needing to think about, hey, the customer can also see this. And what you also have to do, you definitely have to start defining your classification scheme and strategy. So now we're moving on to collaboration settings. Microsoft Teams works with policies. So what are the important policies you definitely have to take a look at and take some steps to change these or enable them. So the first one is Teams policies. That's the easiest one there is because there's only one option at the moment. And that option allows you to enable private channels. Something I definitely recommend doing, but keep in mind, you also have to work on your adoption strategy. So you have to tell your owners like, hey, you can create private channels. This is why we are enabling it. This is what the purpose is, etc., etc. So here you enable it. I believe it's enabled by default, but you can also enable this for a selection of people instead of for all your business users. So all the policies in Microsoft Teams allow you to specify a group of people. So it doesn't always have to doesn't always have to be applied to everybody within your organization. There's also something called app policies. You're probably aware that Microsoft Teams works with a lot of apps. These are the Microsoft apps, OneNote, To Do, SharePoint, etc., etc. I would advise to enable those because that's the minimum you need for an efficient collaboration within Microsoft Teams. And then there's a lot of third-party apps. Like I'm 90% I've never heard of. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think you overwhelm your business users with so much choice and they don't really need it. So I would advise to limit it. So when you talk to your business users, ask them, hey, you want to collaborate? Are you currently using non-Microsoft services or apps, whatever? Maybe they say yes, and we still want to use it. Then enable those apps and block everything else, right? So when you talk to them, ask that as well. Because it can always be that there's a system, you have Jira, for example, that's used with a lot of organizations. Yeah, sometimes it can be helpful to also enable an integration with that within your Teams environment. Review the team and channel settings. So on the left side, you see all the default options for members. So that means you can decide to turn those on or off. For example, like working with connectors, I don't know if they necessarily need to do that. So that's something you can think about. Like, hey, do I really want my members to work with that? Just give them that option, but that can result in a lot of questions, and maybe you want to stay away from that, so you just disable that option. Well, we talked a couple times about classification, and this is where we dive into that part. So what is classification? So with classification, you can basically define the purpose of a team. This is a project. This is a department. This is a customer. What you can also classify is the level of sensitivity. Is it a team that's basically meant for internal purposes, like a department, or maybe it's also maybe highly sensitive. So everything that's discussed in this team is from highly sensitive content. And the content can be, of course, files, but also chat. So maybe there's a team for the board of directors or the management team that can then be classified as highly sensitive. So how do you create a classification scheme? So this is very depending on some regulations you have to comply with. So for example, in European Union, as I live in the Netherlands, as part of the EU, we have GDPR. But in the US, you, for example, have the Health Insurance Act. There are a lot more. So often, often your classification scheme, and I will show you one that we use with a lot of our customers, is dependent on that. So this is one I will talk with you about. This is one we use with most of our customers. So this is one that's actually being used in the real world. The first one is personal. So that means that this content is for me. It's just for me as Jasper, and it's not business data. So this is often data that's stored, for example, in OneDrive. So that can be for example, an invoice, for example, Amazon, something I purchased there, and I stored them on OneDrive temporarily. Then we have public data. So this is data that's actually meant to be shared externally. So I worked with a museum in the Netherlands. They work on news items. They share with TV stations, for example. In that case, that's public, right? The default is often internal. That means that the content I'm working on is meant for internal purposes, but if it's shared externally by accident or on purpose, is not a huge deal, right? There's not like a security breach, for example. Then you move on to confidential. Yeah, this data is for internal purposes only, or specifically shared with a couple of external people, but on purpose. Like, hey, those people do need to have access, but nobody else. And then you get to the highest one. It's basically top secret or really, really confidential. Just kind of the name you attach to it. Yeah, this data again is meant internally for a small group of people and definitely not for the whole outside world to see. So once you define the classification scheme, how can you apply it? Of course, you can use Microsoft Information Protection, and again with the sensitivity labels. But you can also use ShareGet Apricot. That works with, there's something that Larry will discuss later on as well. But how do these labels work with teams? So let's say I have my classification scheme. I created my sensitivity labels during the creation of a team. So when I create a team, I can select one, or maybe I change it during while I'm working with the team. That's possible as well. What I can do is enforce certain security settings. So let's say I have a label called project. I can automatically determine the privacy of the team. So public or private, right? I can immediately disable guest access, for example. Like, hey, with this label, nobody's allowed to invite guests. And this is where the type of external sharing link comes back. So I can say only when this label is applied, people are only able to share files with existing guests, for example, or new and existing, or not at all. Maybe you can block it as well. You can also block it completely. And you can also determine the type of access when you're using an unmanaged device. So that it revolves around mobile device management. You give your employees a device to work with from your organization, or you allow them to use their private devices. Yeah. What you can define here is that when somebody accesses the content stored in SharePoint with an unmanaged device, their access is blocked, so they cannot work with it. They can only use the web with some limited options, or they get full access to the Office application. So this is something you have to discuss internally with the person who's responsible. In most cases, will be Intune. You have to be aware that a license is required for this. So kind of to round it up, what is our recommendation of our recommendations? So definitely start with defining your classification scheme. So everything will be shared, right? The recording, the slides. So you can definitely reuse the one I shared with you. It's very important for teams. That's the focus we have for today. But don't forget content, right? Because teams, it works both ways. You have the team itself and its content. So definitely look at that as well from that point of view. And then definitely, you have to define it, but also implement your classification and tagging system. So what are our takeaways for part one? And then we'll take a look at all the questions you asked. I'm very curious. So of course, the first one, you have to talk with your business users, because they want to collaborate and they know what they want, right? Especially these days, right? They're very clear what they want and what they don't want. So you have to find out what their needs are, right? And then you as IT admin can help them with that. Definitely, I know maybe it's scary, but definitely enable guest access, because believe me, people will do it in a different way. You cannot avoid it anymore. Long time ago, that was possible, right? People barely had internet at home. They were very restricted to working in the office, but these days, it's like, you can do whatever you want once you're connected to the internet. So enable guest access and share links at the organization level. And then, of course, make sure you monitor that as well, right? That's very important. And again, of course, define your classification scheme and strategy. I mentioned it a couple of times now, but I hope you realize it's very important. So before I go to the questions, I had a couple resources. You can take a look if you're interested in that. Well, this one will be shared again later, how you can contact us. But I think what we can do now, we still have some time left. We have 15 minutes. We also want to take a little break between the sessions, but I think now it's maybe a good time to go over the questions. I think, Larry, you have to tell them to me, because I don't think I'm able to...
Yeah, I'll go. And you know what they say? They say be careful what you wish for, because we asked for a question and that's what we received. We've got a lot of them, so we're going to try to go through as many questions as possible. We might not be able to go through all of them because there's a lot of them, but we'll do our best to go through as many as possible. So let's get started. So we've got an anonymous listener who asked us, would you recommend to start creating teams in Teams, or to start on SharePoint and link those on Teams?
I think it kind of depends on what your current situation is. So let's say you've already been working with SharePoint for a while. We have your SharePoint. Maybe you started with SharePoint on premises, moved to the cloud. maybe if you're in that situation, then it's a good idea to start from there. If you start from scratch, I would just advise immediately do it from within Teams, because that's the application people are going to be working with most of the time. So that then they already can do it from within there as well, so they get used to the application and all its features. So it just depends on where you are currently. So if you're already working in SharePoint Team sites, do it from there, and otherwise just do it from within Teams itself.
Wonderful. We have Simon asking, can you rename an existing team to align an existing team to your naming convention? So I guess a user creating a team is not respecting naming convention. You want to go back and adjust to that. Is that something possible?
Yeah, you can do that. So you, especially as an admin, you always have the ability to change that. You can also change the SharePoint URL these days if that's required. Before you do that, I would advise to test it first. And I'm specifically talking about the changing URL, because I remember in the past, when you did that, the Files tab within the channel of Teams, it broke. I believe it's fixed, because I believe it's fixed, but please try that out before you do it on a production team, so to speak. But yeah, that's definitely possible. Yeah.
Great. We have Shayla, who asks us, is there a way around being able to customize the order of folders within a channel? So it defaults to alphabetical, but life cycle order needed.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's specifically, the question is around the folders that are added within a channel, or maybe she's referring to because every time you create a channel, a folder is created in the documents library of the SharePoint site. I don't know if she's talking about that order. Yeah, that's I actually had that with a customer maybe a week ago. Because of course, when most customers they work on worked or still working on file shares, so people do the order one, right? 01, 02. Yeah, that doesn't really work in Teams because the general channel doesn't really allow you to rename it yet. So then, yeah, you get kind of like an issue with the order. So currently, there's not really an issue, a solution for that. But I believe Microsoft is working on improving the renaming process of channels. And then in relationship to the folder that's created with it. So I hope I answered understand the question correctly. Otherwise, ask it again in the chat. But that's basically what it is now.
All right. We have Ludovic, who says policies seem to require expensive licenses to be used. Would you recommend them?
The policies within the Microsoft Teams Admin Center should not have needed additional licenses. That should be part of the one you're already in. Yeah, and if you're afraid of additional costs, then SharePoint Apricot's very interesting, because you don't need certain licenses, for example, to work with tags or labels. But yeah, you shouldn't really need to buy additional licenses for certain policies. No.
Okay, cool. We have David, who asks, can we make a dedicated shared document being shared during a certain amount of time and sharing being removed automatically? Otherwise, everyone has to remember who has shared what with whom and tidy up manually each sharing doc across all sites. Before I pass it over to you, Jasper, I want to say that's something you can do with sharing it Apricot pretty easily. We're going to go into more details on that in a later class. But getting visibility over everything that's been shared externally, and also involving your owners to do some. You can automate essentially reviews, external share reviews with your teams and group owners, so they can go ahead and be the ones who decide which external links are still relevant and which ones you should remove. So that can help automate it. But the ShareGate Apricot will also give you very easily that visibility over all of the externally shared links directly in the UI. You'll be able to see everything, who shared it, they shared it with who, basically all the information you need to take action. But yeah.
No, that totally agree. That is difficult. Because it's not that easy to with the standard options within SharePoint to find out what is shared with whom. So yeah, if you have a team and let's say maybe like 15, 20, 25 links to share with different people, becomes difficult to manage that. So what I advise is what I also tell my customers, and when I do training sessions, for example, or requirement sessions, whatever, I tell them, yes, you are able to share a file instead of inviting somebody, but try to keep that to a minimum, because from a management point of view, it's very difficult to see what is shared with whom, right? You can show that additional column. I think it's called shared with, on top of my head. Maybe it's called differently these days. But again, it's not ideal. And if it's too many files, it's not easy to manage. So if you notice, like, hey, we're going to need to collaborate a lot more with this guest, invite him or her to your team. It makes it a lot easier. But yeah, I would advise to go into that direction, or just otherwise disable it completely. Like if you're afraid, like, oh, yeah, I know this team is going to have like so many shared links, it's just going to be unmanageable, then turn it off. But first try to educate your owners and members, saying like, hey, it's fine to share a file, but if you see like, hey, this is going to be too many files, then invite that person to collaborate within teams instead of just sharing a file for each file. It just becomes kind of unmanageable and unworkable.
Yeah. Sorry, there's a little shameless plug there at the beginning. Phil asks us, how do you push updates out to lots of existing teams? Example, add new tab to all teams. Do templates push out updates? If you have built without templates, can you apply one later?
That's a good question. Maybe we should also do this the last question, and we can take a little break, and then we'll reserve the questions for the other sessions, because I think we'll have some time left. Yeah, I don't believe templates do that. There's currently no way to update existing teams based on a template. So imagine create your own template, and you base 10 teams on that, and then you decide to change or add something in the template itself. It won't push it down. What you probably can use is maybe some PnP stuff, so some PowerShell commands, maybe in combination with the Microsoft Graph. I'm not a dev, you can probably hear that, but I'm not a dev, but I know I'm positive if you look into that direction, that maybe with PowerShell in combination with the Microsoft Graph, you can update existing teams. Yeah, but unfortunately not currently with the template. I wouldn't surprise me if Microsoft eventually introduces like a button that says, hey, do you want to update existing teams based on this template? You click on yes, and it will add a channel, for example. But currently, that's not possible out of the box. So you would have to look at PnP PowerShell in combination with the Microsoft Graph. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Do we have time for one last one?
Yeah, do one more. Then we can take a little break.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we have Mathis asking, how would you recommend making sure for the users and not just the moderators know what Microsoft 365 group is, what the purpose of the team or SharePoint site is? So it says it's great if we know that the group is meant as a project group, but we don't really have any tools yet to let other non-admin colleagues know what kind of team it is. Are there any plans or ideas on this, or awaited features for Microsoft that can help you with this? So it's really about giving visibility to non-admins essentially on the nature. So maybe naming convention, or
yeah, if you apply naming convention, that helps. I think that's kind of the only way to do it currently. Yeah, because there's not really a way to categorize it in a Teams application itself. That doesn't exist. So you really the only way would be to use a naming policy, with a naming convention. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. We know we weren't able to answer all the questions. We're still going to have to go for a short break between our sessions. So we'll try to find a way to get those answers to you. Well, I guess we'll maybe talk about that during the break, and we'll get back to you with a plan on those questions, because we want to give you that information. So thanks everyone for joining the first class. Enjoy your break. We'll see you in roughly 4 minutes, and yeah, see you then.